Alright, folks, let's get toasty. I have to deactivate all the machinery around here. If you knew how many videos I made and remade, or at least recorded multiple times, it's enough to drive a man mad. And perhaps it has. That remains to be seen. We're back, Connecticut, and shocker of all shockers, we didn't start with a bridge. Great gollywoggles, what has happened? Although we have been next door, I don't know if we've looked at this exact place here, which is what we're going to do right now. Look at this exact place here. This is the carriage house that belongs to the Mark Twain house, you see. The Mere Carriage House. So mere, in fact, that there's a 50-page write-up about it. Samuel Anghorn Clemens, better known as Mark Twain. This is now a house museum. Well, the house next door is. This is basically just for a conference space, a staff kitchen, a storage space, all that sort of thing. You'll see. They've trashed it. But the story goes, 1873, it was built to accompany the adjoining house. According to a letter from Mr. Twain to General Greene, the construction was to be completed within 1 year, so that Clemens could boast to his brother, "The stable is done." Patrick and family occupy large, handsome rooms in the stable. How nice of you to call your assistant's living quarters the stable. It's made of variously coursed brick, as you can see. Architects E.T., with the E and T stand for Edward Tuckerman Potter and Alfred Thorpe. Their only collaboration. Potter providing the designs, most of the on-site work left to Thorpe. Later on, Potter came out of retirement to renovate the house. Allegedly 8 years later. I'll renovate something 8 years later, but I don't know. That's what they say. Mr. Potter was born to a prominent family closely associated with Union College in New York, upstate New York, and the Episcopal Church. His father was a minister who served as Bishop of Pennsylvania from 1845 to 1865. His mother was the daughter of Dr. Eliphalet Knott, a minister and long-standing president of Union College, and actually a relative via marriage of a friend of the channel. How about that? Small world sometimes. His uncle, Potter's uncle, Horatio, however you, and his brother Henry Codman, how about that middle name, each served as Bishop of New York, and William Potter, the half-brother, also became a prominent architect. E.T. Potter won 2 commissions for major buildings in his alma mater. Soon after his graduation, he joined Dick Upjohn's New York office. Upjohn, who was America's leading architect at the time, at least as far as churches go, and before the École des Beaux-Arts was open to American students, Upjohn's office was a training ground for an elite group of young architects. I love that choice of words. Born in England, Upjohn specialized in the design of Episcopal Church and was especially influenced by the English parish church revival movement. Architectural historians claim he was instilled with a sense for the logic of materials and learned to create his own models by freely reinterpreting previous examples, i.e. ripping others off. Potter, like Dick Upjohn, established himself as a church architect. After just a year at the Upjohn office, he designed his first church building, which is now known to be one of the earliest examples of the high Victorian Goth in the United States. Despite the Civil War breakout, Potter gathered commissions for churches from Rhode Island to Iowa and was considered one of the premier church architects in the United States. He broke form only twice and did 2 domestic buildings, this carriage house being the second and last. That's what we're told. His father-in-law convinced him to retire early in 1877, while still in his 40s, only coming out of retirement to prepare drawings for the renovations of this house, as I said earlier. There's a quote here from George Warner, another Nook Farm resident, who wrote, "He's such a child of genius, I do believe, and he makes everything he touches upon lovely." Strange choice of words. Far less is known about the other architect, Mr. Alfred H. Thorpe, one of the first Americans to attend the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, of course. I might as well just tack that on to every architect ever mentioned in these. Well, anyway, this common bond between the Beaux-Arts training probably was the reason why Potter chose the younger Thorpe. Or perhaps it was the fact that prior to this, Olivia Clemens' sister had already hired him to design a freestanding octagonal study. We'll never know, because these stories exist in the past, and we live in the future. Whatever just happened there. There are no historic photographs of the interior, and no drawings exist, but we're pretty sure that it didn't look like the way it looks now, which is this. I'm pretty sure they didn't have drop-in acoustic panels and recessed lighting in a building that looks like this on the outside. I don't think so. Well, that's just my own very reckless, informed speculation. The folding chairs, however, are original. Clearly rudely abused. There was an investigation done as to the original floor plan of the house based on the lack of drawings, paucity of other materials. That's the resulting write-up is baffling. They find pierced holes in the walls, and they surmise that perhaps this was used to attach a trough. They find a door without a balcony in the second story that they don't understand its existence to, though it is boarded up. They find the basement in the barn strangely located. They imagine there must have been other doors. And a lot of it really is taking this building and struggling to make the narrative fit based on the letters that Mr. Twain had written about his butler living there with his family. There's no mention of that here. It looks like they were just trying to be like, well, this is where the donkeys were and this is where they must have put the hay in. But it's like, was the butler really living with the donkeys and the hay and his family? It doesn't sound like that. Sounds like he was a man of some respect, I guess, or a long-standing servant of Mr. Twain. And in fact, there's writings about him that say his coachman had a room above the stable, but they don't find much to indicate a domestic domicile in which a person would live with a family, unless you're talking about that half a couch right there. This room is the only one that they left historically accurate. Oh, shocking. We go from that to a bridge. How could I ever have guessed that this would happen in Connecticut? How? Really? How could I have known? Let's roll up our sleeves and get into it. I see from this image the usual dilapidated properties boarded up that run alongside these tracks. And I wonder... Bridge probably no longer looks like this, as it has been rehabilitated, so we're told. It was built in 1896 to carry a 4-track right-of-way across the intersection in Norwalk, in the heart of a densely built commercial area of multi-story brick, stone, and cast iron commercial blocks. This area is a historical district, so I'm sure we'll get there at some point. Amtrak shares the right-of-way currently with Metro North Commuter Railroad. The bridge, which is numbered 3693R in the Connecticut Extensive Department of Transportation State Bridge Inventory, I'm sure you can imagine, consists of 3 parallel Pratt trusses, crosses the intersection at an angle of 45 degrees, and etc., etc. It's the heart of the district here. And in the 1890s, there was a large-scale undertaking that rebuilt the main line of New York, New Haven, and Hartford Railroad. 1840s when it was first built, one of the busiest rail corridors in the country, along with freight, commuters, business travelers, and the highly industrialized economy of southern New England required movements of fuel, raw materials, manufactured products, and the people that buy them. So, commonly known as New Haven Railroad, at the time, they began a program to increase the number of tracks from 2 to 4, straighten the curves, eliminate all major grade crossings. South Norwalk presented an especially challenging situation because after the Civil War, this was already a busy harbor, railroad junction, and site of hat factories and other industries. What are you going to do with all the hats? There was a substantial growth at this area after the success of the Civil War, when them damn Yankees claimed victory. The tracks were raised because of the danger to pedestrians and wagons, and because of the extent of the project, not one single supplier of iron could possibly meet the New Haven Railroad's demands, so the net was cast far and wide. In addition to the Berlin Iron Bridge Company, which supplied a number of nearby plate girder spans and the large swing bridge across the Norwalk River just to the east, the railroad bought bridges from R.F. Hawkins, the American Bridge Company of New York, the Penn, Coyd, and Penn Steel Companies from Pennsylvania, and many other suppliers. And finally, 542 tons of steel later, by God, it was constructed. The Berlin Iron Bridge Company, Connecticut's only large-scale 19th century fabricator bridges, given the credit, they began the production of corrugated iron for roofing, and named their company accordingly, the Corrugated Metal Company. But finally, they branched out into ironwork in order to support trusses for roofs. Then they bought the patent rights to an iron truss, changed the name, went on to become New England's largest structural fabricator, building bridges as far away as Texas. A real success story of the area. for now. Until 1900, of course, when the Berlin Iron Bridge Company was acquired by the American Bridge Company, which was basically a monopoly on the country's structural fabricating industry, and they closed the plant down. Now, former employees tried to restart. Well, I shouldn't say try, considering they regained a lot of the regional business, and they still do business today under the name Berlin Steel. So yeah, they kind of resurrected it. Despite the monopolizers' attempts, we stay Connecticut strong, they probably said. Or maybe they said Corrupticate. I don't know. Probably not. Now, they did use massive masonry abutments, as you can see, which were standard for railroad construction in the period, as we've learned. And there were numerous granite quarries along the shore, right by the New Haven Railroad, so transportation wasn't really a problem. Logistically, still a remarkable feat for 1890, especially. It really is. Make that work to that dense commercial development. And what have we here? Well, wouldn't you like to know? Now, at first glance, this may look to you like some sort of a staffet or something underneath the surface there. Really, it's not. It's just the segue into a very boring, long-winded tale about water filtration. Allow me to, indulge. Now, I know we're here for old world buildings and stuff, but as I've said before, I am a slave to the survey. Wherever it takes us, there we go. And so if she wants to take us to a place about water filtration, then that's where we go. But often I do find that you learn something that you didn't know before about the area or about an industry in particular. And so, with the banner of optimism flying high, we proudly progress forward, come what may. And what you're looking at is the Lake Whitney water filtration plant. The short version of this is that in the middle of the 18th century, he began Longley. Communities began to expand into these densely populated cities, which needed infrastructure capable of supplying pure water for drinking, industrial use, and firefighting. But I would add, sewage and solid waste. New Haven already had a plentiful supply of water. The city is at the end of a flat, fertile valley in the end of a drainage basin. But that river is tidal and brackish. And this was okay because in the 17th century, there were springs and shallow wells. And there was a stream from the New Haven Green to East Creek, and there was a pump at the corner of Green, which was providing ample drinking water for the central area. By the mid-1800s, though, all the forests were removed, and all the hills were leveled, and this lowered the water table, and they needed new sources of potable water. Not to mention population growth and periodic drought. This combined with, outdoor privies and runoff from city streets where horse-drawn transport added to its share of the pollution, forced people to look for new sources. City grows, development fills open space, water for fire protection added to the compelling need. Now, although New Haven had been progressive and required brick construction in buildings near the city center since 1815, the extant wooden buildings were fuel for a major conflagration. Water for firefighting, which the canal had supplied since 1835, was protection along the business section. But when the New Haven Railroad converted the canal to a railroad, got that? Converted the canal to a railroad, they eliminated this water source, and there was no significant defense against a major fire, and by 1859 fires were very frequent and commonly originated farther away from the water supplies. And so they needed to develop a new water supply system for these fires. That's the story. It was retarding growth. The well water was high in mineral content, destructive to stationary and locomotive engine boilers, and hotel owners and storekeepers' offices and 196 manufacturing enterprises indicated a willingness to pay liberally for an adequate water supply. Some manufacturers threatened to leave the city unless they obtained public water. They also needed it for flushing the streets of horse doo-doo. That's what it says here, doo-doo. I may or may not have lied just now. However, these Yankees' sense of thrift opposed paying for something nature had put at their back door. It's more of a South thing, but... In 1852, a city meeting passed a resolution appointing a committee to report on the most practical means of supplying water, at which point they approached Mr. Eli Whitney II, because he owned property, you see, on Mill River, and they wanted to build a plant that would serve New Haven, an area known as Point of Rocks. There was a dam here, but Eli Whitney's father, Eli Whitney, had provided power to his armory and grist mills in the colonial period. Now we're way past that. No one ever think of colonizing anything anymore, right? Well, anyway, someone named Charles McClellan and Son and Eli Whitney II constructed the works themselves, apparently. They're paid by the city. And so they essentially, despite rival companies' interference and despite the usual water wars that happen, where the fight between public-owned water, private-owned water, hits the legislature, and there's all sorts sorts of back and forth on that. City government at the time was held in such a low self-esteem, though, that actually Whitney prevailed. Despite a probably government-instigated typhoid epidemic, which was traced back to Mr. Whitney's lake, which had shocked the city into greater awareness of public health, it still wasn't enough to result in popular demand for city government-owned water supply. The people back then in Connecticut weren't such statists. So what they did do, though, is force the company to construct a water filtration plant. And that is what you are looking at right now, with the new State Board of Health now overseeing recreational use of Lake Whitney, closing picnic grounds and constructing public dams, forcing all sorts of regulations on Mr. Whitney and his lakes. Although they were allowing the Yale crew to continue to use, the rowing events, of course, Yale gets a pass. Even private owners along the shores were not even allowed to sail or rent boats on their own lakefront property. 1,200 million gallons. That's what they held. The company patrolled the watershed on a daily basis, removing trash and manure from highways, burning leaves and rubbish, etc., etc. And so they built a slow sand filter on Lake Whitney. That's what they did. They hired a Mr. George Fuller. Even though Lake Whitney didn't have the typhoid breakout, it was actually a much smaller lake that had nothing to do with any of this. Regardless, apparently they built over some pre-existing buildings. And so the way this works is actually, and I won't go too deep into this, other than to point out that these buildings look, old. And not necessarily original. I mean, I don't know why you would have these entrances and you block them up, but it seems a little artsy for what it is. So maybe it was an old star fort. Actually, now that I think about it, maybe it was here that they just filled in and then pretended that it was, or maybe they used it. You know what? Eureka! I have always suspected, actually, that star forts were actually large fountains, which I actually detailed in a video that I didn't even release, actually, I just realized. But that's my theory on them, is that they were the centrally located water fountains. And they would also purify the water and send it trickling down into town. And also that they probably had to do with energy production, which now that I'm thinking about it is exactly what this did. We're told that there was a dam here that created the energy for the armory and filtrated the water. Wow, this actually is maybe a missing link to. Just realized that. Okay, when you realize something in real time. Okay, so I'll flesh that out later. But how it works is this. It's an engineering design it requires like mechanical filtration and then also primarily biological activity, which would be more in line with what we would think the world used to operate on. It's a bed of sand, like fine sand, coarse sand, then fine gravel and crushed stone. The sand portion is like 3 feet deep and the gravel and stone segment is about 16 inches deep. There's 12 of these beds in this plant, which is about an area of like 4 acres, and they're in a building that are set partially underground of reinforced concrete construction. The roof is covered by like 2 feet of earth, which is where they planted grass. And these passages right here, like this one, they're basically access alleys. There's passages that collect the water and converge it all to a collector system, which then, all the water is transferred basically to a large well. The water from this well is pumped to mains throughout the system, the city. This is a central galley right here. It has all the piping and the valves that get the water from the beds and directed to the pumping station and all that. And then there's a ground floor of this gallery that has doorways to the beds, valves that control water to and from the beds, and then cleaning equipment and stuff like that. There's a lab up top on the roof, and that's the only part you can actually see from the streets. So this system, the sand system here you see one that's emptied out while they maintain it. It's a well-established technology at this time. It was in Scotland, I think, was the first one that was built that they know of in 1804. In America, the earliest one was Louisville, Kentucky, 1875. So in this process, what happens is water goes through all the feet of sand, which is supported on all those layers of gravel, and this has to be kind of regulated. Straining doesn't remove like bacteria, but there's these protozoa that exist that eliminate them through biological action. So this protozoa forms a layer on top of the sand called the schmutzdeck, and this layer of living protozoa, it forms a biological filter which traps the bacteria and eats it. So what it needs is a structure where you can clean the sand beds from time to time, because this layer layer, this biological layer sometimes forms almost like a gelatinous, impenetrable barrier that you'd have to purge from time to time. So it's a very actually organic system. And of course, you gotta have a biological laboratory for water purity analysis and stuff like that, also. And this worked until, I think, the 90s, actually. They don't use it anymore. So these photographs are of, clearly, obviously, abandoned buildings. But this is what it once did. And I wonder, now, if the technology is not so hidden and not so distant. Right, of course, we gotta get those shots in to show you how far away it was and all that. Yeah, hard to imagine that this one horse in this little wagon could move concrete like that for very long with no men visible. Like, what is this? I guess there's one guy here. It seems like quite an operation for like 2 dudes. Yeah, I don't know. The picture looks sus. Here's at least a few more. This at least looks somewhat plausible. Again, I don't know how you're even getting this machinery to the site. It looks like it's too much for horses. Unless you're casting it on site, I guess. Something just odd about it all. Seems like not enough dudes. This would take forever to build this thing. Talking 8 acres. Here they are laying the brick, allegedly. I mean, I guess if you got a bricklayer every 5 feet, all doing it at the same time, with, of course, their handler here. The prefabricated doorways are just bricking around. I mean, that seems like this would take a long mother bleeping time working like that. This is a big, big facility. Oh, Mr. Labcoat. His beakers. And then, to make it even more suspicious, the outbuildings, of course, have these foundations and doorways all bricked in. And this smokestack of what's probably the old armory. I mean, look at that. So what is going on here? Like, why have these doorways and then brick them in? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Why? It doesn't make any sense. Why build like this? Build that, how hard it would be to make, like structurally and, just technically to make these archways out of brick. One after another, and just to brick them in? I just don't know what the point of that would be, other than to thoroughly frustrate the mason. And that foundation? Too many questions that these stories simply don't tell the whole thing. They just don't. Of course, I believe that this was used for what they say, yeah. But I mean, look at the size of that friggin' smokestack. How are you even... I just don't... Doesn't it seem overkill for that site? Like, look, we're at the tops of these trees now. And you had to make this thing like 100 feet higher? And why the material shift from old brick to block? It's just... too many questions that are unsatisfied by the answer provided. That's it. That's my conclusion. But a remarkable feat, whoever did do it. And even repurposing it or reusing it is a remarkable feat. I'm not trying to take anything away from the engineers of the time. I mean, take something and you make something out of it is just as great as creating it. I'm not knocking it. It just doesn't match the visuals. It's not about discrediting the work ethic or the efforts of prior generations. It's not about saying nah, you couldn't have. It's not about that. That was no doubt some of the hardest working people that probably ever lived, at least we know of, as far as they were able to accomplish. That doesn't take anything away from it. That's not the goal, discrediting anyone, but it doesn't match what you see. Like your brain, you can't just hear a story. It's like this building was built normally. And you look at it and it's mismatched and wonky. The basement doesn't make sense. There's so much extra effort put into it that isn't explained. There's a change of materials that aren't explained. There are repurposed doors that it doesn't make sense. And so logically, you're asking too much with the stories and the photographic evidence of a critical thinking person. You're asking too much. And we've been lied to so many times. We would just like to know the truth. Who cares if you found it that way and you repurposed it? Who cares if you found it that way and you didn't know what to do with it, but you made something out of it? What is the shame in that? It's the fact that there's obvious hidden truths that's maddening. Because why would you lie? Except to keep something from the people, except to control the people. And that's the part that grinds the gears, because we don't like to be controlled. We don't like to be made fools of, taken advantage of, and it seems diabolical. Now, if you're just enterprising humans that got here first and your families want their way, well, that's just as despicable and selfish. But it leads to an anti-human agenda, which leads us to believe that there's something anti-human behind it. An anti-human is probably non-human. And so these are where the thoughts lead, and this is where the suspicion grows, and the unrest settles in. This is where the hairs on the back of your neck go up, and you squint into the light, wondering what it is that you're not seeing, wondering what lies beneath the surface. And the more precise and logical and detailed the write-ups, the more glaring the absences, the lack of information, the holes. It's like a Pennsylvania window frame, which Connecticut is clearly, liberally borrowed from here in this display of this old rail house, or rail yard, or whatever. Wait, I'm supposed to tell you. Rail yard! New Haven rail yard, to be precise. And of course, it's being reconfigured, so of course they gotta do a write-up about it. Now, we're told that the heart of the operation is on the second floor, where all the smashed windows are, which makes sense. I mean, actually, no, it doesn't. The first floor is open and filled with all the electromechanical relay systems that carry the information. Hundreds of encoders and other electromechanical relays and stuff like that. Information carried in coded form over telegraph wires and buried cables, although the system was intended to work with microwave transmission as well. Now, I don't know what any of that means from a technical point of view. But the basic principle is that operators can change the state of a section of track, like a route, by pushing just 2 buttons, and the relays are wired together so that all the switch machines and track signals are activated in the proper order to accomplish that. And then there's lights that are transmitted back to the operator console to show them that it worked. They can do an individual route by pressing buttons at the entrance and exit of the desired route, but the whole process from the initiation to the lights, it takes just a few seconds, and then the setup automatically cancels as the train passes unless they want it to stay that way for the next train, so they can sort of lock in these routes and things like that. Now, I know the building looks like it's been upkept very well, but trust us, the machinery works very great and doesn't need any maintenance at all for it to operate, so you're totally safe. Tell that to all your freight friends. Track mileage not great. The New Haven Railroad was still one of the nation's busiest passenger and freight operations. And the shoreline route along Long Island Sound was the most congested. That railroad's most congested. It had commuters, long-distance passengers, were packed with industry. And this section, this railway controlled 20-mile section that had 47 different turnouts and 58 crossovers, and there were 250 signals, and so this was a very important freight facility. Now, prior to this all being put in one building, there were 5 different towers, along with a number of hand-thrown switches. Daily traffic is, they would say, 70 passenger trains, 30 passenger trains one way, 70 the other way, 50 freight trains. So quite a substantial labor investment and equipment, really, to get all these relays in order. But they only had to go down from 46 to 12 operators, so less delays, more efficiency, less overhead, and less need for the building. It was the largest control project at the time of the railroad, and they were going to expand it, but instead they hit limitations. With the basically abandonment of the selling of the New Haven Railroad, all the equipment was removed, and it was made just upgraded, I guess, to accommodate the Amtrak railway, as largely railroad stuff went out of fashion, and buildings like this were left to the vultures. Except for that nice couch, in case someone wants to sit there and take a look at that super old school dope-ass refrigerator. And yeah, an era gone by the wayside. All these relays and things looking very steampunk and Dr. Doomish. Alack and alas, were all to be taken away, never to be seen again. Though some people say in a dark night, you can still hear the click and the whir and the blinking lights of transmitted codes. And some say that there will come a time when the New Haven rail yard interlocking control building will rise from the ashes and bring forth its wrath on humanity. But that's just what some people say. I don't really agree with those people. I think they're just, whoa. What in great auspice Pamonti is that? And why? What is this? What is the point of this? And star-spangling it as well? You know it wasn't originally that way. You know it. What is this? Oh, that's right. This is the ridiculous Colt Firearms Company. And this has been repurposed. This old Colt Firearms manufacturing plant, probably at this point, easily, into high-density population center. And they've kept that ridiculous dome that looks so out of place. That should be in Moscow. I commend them for the repurposing of the buildings, although what else are you going to do, tear them all down? They're massive. I bet the area didn't appreciate the loss of the jobs in the industry, and I bet much was lost in the retaming and reforming of this. I see here by the call signs that we are veering into historic American engineering record territory, which is why the sudden focus on very technical things, processes and technologies and things like that. And that's why this one's probably taking a more technical turn. The end of these surveys, they tend to kind of have some overlap, and you'll see that happen. The Cold Gateway, eh? Wow. So yeah, this is more about engineering. It's not exactly part of the American Building Survey. And I don't mind seeing it, in small doses, some of it. But that dome, I'm looking at the size of those blocks pulling out of these walls. But that dome is ridiculous. I understand it's a landmark, and I'm sure it was probably always there from the dawning of time. And how you gonna get rid of that? I'm glad they didn't, but it just stands out so much. Oh, weird. The building extends down into the ground. That's weird. No one expected that except everyone ever. And yeah, I guess it was dilapidated before. And this was company housing. Old company housing, it looks to be, for the aforementioned Colt Firearms Facility. Very picturesque area here. And a mystery who makes these walls, and for what, and for whom. What's the original purpose? How deep do they go? And what are we doing here with this very symmetrical? Did this used to hold an obelisk? It looks like it did, didn't it? But now, just another, oh, of course, you just had to throw another frickin' bridge in our face, didn't you, Connecticut? No matter how rustic, you just had to be like, oh, you want some help across? Let me get you a bridge. You just did that just to be snarky, didn't you? I might have known. And now we've hit the color section, which is where they decided not to get cheap and actually show some of these pictures in color that they previously showed us in black and white. I don't know why they do that, but they do. And here we have more shots of the being repurposed Colt Firearms Factory, I can imagine. And sadly, no more. Oh, Bryant. Okay, this is, I'm wrong. This is the Bryant Electric Company. The same kind of history. This is in Fairfield, though. Bridgeport. Which was a small area, actually in a part of the Stratford known as Newfield. A few English families were harvesting shellfish and selling and growing salt hay. And during the 1790s, they would trade between the West Indies. So they traded their grain and timber and some manufactured stuff for rum and sugar. And so there's merchants and there's sea captains and sailors and all sorts of stuff. And they wanted their own little political subdivision. So they incorporated as a borough so they could regulate construction and get their own fire department and all that stuff. They built a couple flour mills, and farming was difficult, as much of New England. So they had to combine that with manufacturing stuff. And they were resourceful workers. The average guy was an average farmer or working guy was resourceful, solved problems. There's always shortage of labor. And so these workers were available when the Industrial Revolution impacts New England. By the way, this is all allegedly what we're told. And they helped make Connecticut a leader in the American Industrial Revolution and hardware capital of the world, which is why they get amazing buildings like this, apparently. And so Bridgeport finally separates from Stratford as a town, and they start making saddles and carriages and garments. That's kind of their dominant industries. And the railroad obviously helps everything out, creates jobs and all that. Large workers move into the area. Working class neighborhoods, developing, big immigrant populations, lovely brickwork there. Hungarian immigrants were established, a big portion of them. And Bryant Electric Company employed most of them. But it also had Slovenians and Swedes and French Canadians and also some orcs. But the area around there, there's an organ manufacturer, there's a toy maker, there's a typewriter factory, all kinds of stuff. Mr. Bryant, Waldo Bryant, born in Massachusetts, after grade school, learned to be a machinist, goes to Polytech Institute, works for what became General Electric, and opens up an electric service shop here, where they would do automatic doorbells that rang when people stepped on a switch that was in a doormat, and this got them going. Actually, his actual real contribution to the electrical industry was making wired devices standardized. So there were these 8 different types of light bases, so people were always looking for parts to fit their equipment. And he was a leader in getting standard devices accepted by the industry. He patented switches and things like that, and so safety switches. And he used to run this out of a room over a bank rented on Main Street until he had this, because of his switch, gave him enough money to build this behemoth, which is pretty wild. It was a schoolhouse it was originally owned by P.T. Barnum until it expanded. So, the same old friggin' who's who of who's who dominating the world. This is the Saybrook Breakwater Light, built in 1885. Part of the infrastructure at the mouth of the Connecticut River, where it empties into Long Island Sound. Before they would use buoys, which were inadequate at times. This is a segmented cast iron tower with a lantern resting on the cast iron and concrete foundation. The base is surrounded with boulder riprap to protect it from waves and ice. So this is a 30 feet in diameter cylinder, 32 feet high, and there's, prefabricated cast iron plates holding the whole thing together. In total it's 4 stories, and it's kind of a basic, standard historical cast iron prefab built by the engineers of the U.S. Lighthouse Board and all that. And of course, another bridge from Bridgeland, to no one's surprise. This is bridge number 00761, if you ain't heard yet. Spanning the Housatonic River. Though many name changes were proposed, many name changes were not agreed upon. And so they just named it after the river that it crosses. Very uncreatively. But this was built between 1939 and 40 to connect the famous Merritt Parkway, which we've done lots of, and the Wilbur Cross Parkway. Second bridge over this river. 1940 was the opening date. Took less than a year, weirdly. And it's not considered to be part of either parkway, just kind of an independent process. It's 57 years since it's been around. Well, since the time of the writing. Since its induction to this survey, and it's not really been changed since then. Now, to me, they say the foundation work for this was simple and without incident, and I would say that's because the foundation was already there. I mean, if you go on just looks, the bottom doesn't match the top. Just doesn't. I understand it's different material, but even stylistically, this is just pure industry, no aesthetics. And then you look at the concrete work, and it's just completely different. It's got grace and style, and you can just imagine that this was here already. Maybe they touched it up, and they obviously planted new beams on it. And again, I only say that based on visuals, of course. And I mean, of course, the write-up here is kind of silly. That says, well, the foundation, we don't even need to talk about it. It was super simple. But the rest of it, and it goes on and on about the beams and all this. But it's like, to me, the foundation of a bridge would be the most difficult part, honestly. I mean, we are talking about planting pylons into the river, right? I mean, this seems like to be the most important and difficult part of the whole thing. But no, it gets one sentence in the write-up. It's reasons like that, America, that make me suspicious. Reasons just like that. Another bridge, eh? I feel like you're doing this on purpose, Connecticut. And this is a nice little bridge, though. I mean, look at that thing. But you know what? We'll get to that next time, because I'm burning alive here. And I can't maintain current core temp. But I will see you soon. Make it stop, Jimmy. Shit, I told him you were gone.